A billion-dollar deal was about to be signed. The Millionaire CEO, Marcos D., to impress his new German partners, began reading the contract in German, mocking the cleaner who was cleaning the room. She doesn't understand a word. But suddenly, the woman interrupted the reading. In perfect German, she pointed out a fatal error in the translation that would cost the company millions. The foreign partner slammed the table and the boardroom of Bishop Metals, in the beating heart of Manhattan, was a bubble of tense silence about to burst. From the 30th floor, the city stretched out like a chessboard of opportunities that, for Michael Bishop, seemed to be closing in. The air conditioning, set to a frigid temperature, couldn't cool the bead of sweat that insisted on trickling down his temple. Across from him, sitting with impeccable posture, Herr Schmidt, the representative of the Berlin Investment Consortium, maintained an indecipherable expression. His blue eyes, as cold as the steel Michael's company produced, analyzed every gesture, every faltering word. Michael's entire fortune, built over decades of risky deals and relentless dedication, was on that table, summarized in a 40-page contract written in German and English. This investment wasn't just a capital injection, it was the only life raft in an ocean of debt that threatened to drown the empire his father had built. Michael cleared his throat, feeling the collar of his Italian linen shirt tighten around his neck. He, who had always prided himself on his shrewdness and his ability to command any room, felt like an unprepared student in a final exam. His two translators, young and visibly nervous, sat a step behind him, squirming every time he decided to speak in his rudimentary German. It was a pathetic attempt to impress, to show a control he was far from possessing. He wanted to project the image of a global leader, a man whose fortune hadn't isolated him from the world. But in practice, he just sounded like an arrogant fool. "Und hier, in Klausel 12, wir sehen," he began, his clumsy pronunciation scratching the silence. He pointed to a line in the document, his finger trembling slightly. "This means that your company waives the late delivery penalty in favor of a production bonus." The translators glanced at each other, a mixture of panic and shame on their faces. The translation was grossly incorrect, almost inverting the clause's meaning. Herr Schmidt didn't move a muscle, but the slight arch of his eyebrow was enough to send a chill down Michael's spine. The German knew. He knew Michael was either lying or worse, incompetent. Desperation began to rise in Michael's throat like bitter bile. He had to reverse this, to reassert his power. He was Michael Bishop, a name that meant wealth and power on the American industrial landscape. His assets were vast, but his liabilities had grown like a hungry shadow. He needed this money to rebalance his cash flow and ensure dividends continued to be paid. Without this deal, the word bankruptcy would go from a whisper in the hallways to a headline in the Wall Street Journal. He needed more time, a distraction, anything to get him out of this humiliating spotlight. He was about to try another phrase in his butchered German when a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the tension. The boardroom door opened with a discreet creak. All eyes, previously fixed on the contract that would seal the fate of Bishop Metals, turned in unison. In the doorway, standing with a modest posture, was a woman with graying hair tied in a simple bun, wearing the gray uniform of the cleaning staff. In her hands, a silver tray with porcelain cups and a thermal carafe of steaming coffee. The fresh aroma of the brew filled the room, a mundane and disconcerting element amidst the charged atmosphere. Michael felt a wave of fury flush his face. The interruption, however trivial, felt like a personal affront, an unacceptable breach in his fragile theater of competence. Who dared to interrupt the moment that would define his future? The woman was Eleanor. Michael knew her by sight, a silent figure who moved through the shadows of his corporate empire, always with her head down and a quiet efficiency. She was part of the furniture, a functional component of the building, not a person with a voice or a presence. Her entrance at this critical moment was, to him, a glitch in the system, a gear jamming in the perfectly oiled machine of his business. The anger he felt was disproportionate, but it was born of fear, of the panic of seeing the house of cards that was his fortune about to collapse. He needed a scapegoat, a target to unload the frustration consuming him, and she, with her simplicity and submission, was the perfect target. Eleanor, oblivious to the storm brewing in the CEO's mind, walked with measured steps to the imposing mahogany table. Her hands, marked by work, were steady as she placed the tray down. She served the coffee into each of the porcelain cups with a care that bordered on reverence, the dark, steaming liquid contrasting with the immaculate white of the china. Michael watched the scene with contempt. This mundane ritual in the middle of a multi-million-dollar negotiation was absurd. He saw an opportunity to turn the tables, to use the situation to his advantage. He composed himself, forcing a condescending smile, and turned to Herr Schmidt, switching to English, a language he commanded with the same fluency he used to sign checks. "Don't worry, Herr Schmidt," he said, his voice sounding falsely casual. "She's invisible. Doesn't understand a word of what we're saying. She's just the help." The sentence hung in the air, laced with a cold poison. The translators shrank in their chairs, their faces flushing with second-hand embarrassment. Eleanor, who was finishing pouring the last cup, showed no reaction, as if the words hadn't reached her. This apparent indifference irritated Michael even more. He turned to her, the smile vanishing to be replaced by a mask of impatience, and snapped in English, "Just keep cleaning. We're discussing things you could never understand in your life. Things about real money, about the capital that moves the world." He felt a sick satisfaction as he uttered the words, as if belittling her made him bigger. He believed his demonstration of power, his ability to treat a human being like an object in front of a potential business partner, would project an image of unshakable authority. Herr Schmidt, however, merely took the cup Eleanor offered him with a slight nod, his eyes following the cleaning woman as she moved silently toward the window, where she began to wipe an imperceptible smudge from the glass. Michael, interpreting the German's silence as approval, felt a renewed wave of confidence. He had regained control. The mistake was forgotten. Now was the time to deliver the final blow, to prove his cunning. He turned his attention back to the document, his finger finding the clause he had mentally rehearsed for days. It was the most complex, the most dangerous, and he was betting everything on the other side's ignorance and his own audacity. He read the long sentence about guarantees and penalties allowed in his atrocious German. The air in the room grew heavy again, all ears attentive. Then, with the most serious expression he could muster, he offered his deliberately false translation, a lie that, if accepted, would save his company and secure an exorbitant profit at the investor's expense. "As you can see," he concluded, "the clause stipulates that, in case of failure to meet the deadline, Bishop Metals will pay a symbolic fine, but will retain full control over the shares offered as collateral." He smiled, the predator who had just cornered his prey. The silence that followed was deep, absolute. Michael expected a counter-proposal, a discussion but not the void. It was then that her voice, low but clear as crystal, cut through the room. "Mr. Bishop, forgive me." Eleanor's voice, though soft, resonated through the boardroom like an alarm bell in the tense silence. Michael blinked, slow to register the interruption. The blood ran cold in his veins. He, who had just delivered what he thought was his masterstroke, felt like a performer whose stage had collapsed at the peak of his performance. It couldn't be possible that this woman, the invisible one, dared to challenge him. Her audacity seemed a personal insult, an affront to his authority and, more importantly, to his intelligence. His eyes, which moments before had shone with the satisfaction of triumph, now narrowed in a contained fury. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice hissing between his teeth. "Didn't I tell you to be quiet? Didn't I say we're discussing things you could never understand? Don't you see we're closing a multi-million-dollar deal, one that represents the difference between prosperity and the loss of all my capital?" The veiled threat in his words was clear, a warning for her to stay in her place. Eleanor, however, did not back down. Her brown eyes, which had previously seemed like mere pools of resignation, now held a surprising serenity. She took a deep breath, as if gathering a courage that had long been dormant. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice still calm, though slightly firmer. But you've made a mistake." The simplicity of the statement, the absence of any fear or hesitation, struck Michael like a thunderbolt. A mistake? Him? There were no mistakes in his negotiations, only calculated strategies. Her presumption was unacceptable. The translators, who until then seemed petrified, now fidgeted in their chairs, visibly uncomfortable. Herr Schmidt, for his part, remained impenetrable, his eyes shifting between Michael and Eleanor as if watching an unexpected play unfold. The tension in the room became almost palpable, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Eleanor then did something no one expected. She turned to Herr Schmidt, her eyes meeting his with a frankness not seen in the cowed gazes of the others present. And then, in fluent, technical German that shocked everyone in the room, she began to speak. "Herr Schmidt, please forgive the intrusion." But what Mr. Bishop read was Clause 12, which indeed addresses a fine for late delivery. However, he translated it as if it were Clause 9. Clause 9 is what we are actually discussing, and the one he attempted to misinterpret. It does not establish a symbolic fine. Quite the contrary. She paused briefly, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. The translators were now open-mouthed, their faces pale, watching the scene with disbelief. Michael himself felt a shiver run down his spine. The fluency of the language, the precision of the legal terminology, the absolute confidence in her voice. "It was impossible," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining an even more serious tone without a trace of hesitation. Clause 9, Herr Schmidt, stipulates that in the event of a default by Bishop Metals on any stage of the agreement, especially regarding the deadline, the investment consortium would not just be waiving a fine, but would instead acquire 40% of the company's shares as immediate compensation at a prefixed nominal value, without regard to the company's current market value. Furthermore, it provides for the transfer of all voting rights corresponding to those shares. The silence that followed the correction was total. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Michael was speechless, his face pale, his mouth agape, his eyes wide as if he had just seen a ghost. The woman he had humiliated, the invisible one, had just exposed him so publicly and unequivocally that the humiliation was unbearable. His entire house of lies had been brought down by a simple cleaning woman. His billions in assets, his capital, his fortune, everything seemed to be disintegrating before his eyes. He didn't know what to say, what to do. His mind spun, searching for a justification, an escape. But there was none. What would happen next? What would Herr Schmidt do? The future of Bishop Metals, and consequently his own, hung by a thread. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Every second dragged on like an eternity, stretching the tension to a breaking point. Michael felt everyone's eyes on him, the disbelief of the translators, the unnerving calm of Eleanor, and worst of all, the analytical and now dangerously clear gaze of Herr Schmidt. The German investor's face, previously a mask of neutrality, began to transform. A line deepened on his forehead, his lips compressed, and suddenly, an explosion of sound shattered the silence. It wasn't an explosion of anger, as Michael had expected, but something far more shocking. Herr Schmidt slammed his open palm on the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and began to applaud. The claps were slow, deliberate, each one resonating with unmistakable admiration. He rose to his feet, a tall and imposing man, and his eyes, once cold and calculating, now shone with a mixture of surprise and genuine delight. He completely ignored Michael, who was trembling, paralyzed between humiliation and dread. It was as if the billionaire CEO had, in fact, become invisible. The investor walked around the table, his firm steps marking the rhythm of his applause. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor, who remained near the window, her posture still modest despite the earthquake she had just caused. She watched the scene with a quiet dignity, her eyes meeting Herr Schmidt's without hesitation. The German stopped clapping and, in his native tongue, the same one Eleanor had used with such mastery, he asked a question that hung in the air, laden with curiosity and respect. "My lady, with such fluency and legal knowledge, where have you been hiding all this time?" The question was not just a formality, it was a recognition, a validation Eleanor hadn't received in years. She felt a wave of emotion rise in her throat, but she contained it, maintaining the composure that life had taught her to have. Her answer came in the same flawless German, her voice steady, carrying the weight of a history no one in that room could imagine. "I was a professor of international law at the University of Munich for 15 years. The revelation landed like a bomb in the room. The translators looked at each other, their jaws dropped. Michael felt the floor disappear from beneath his feet. Munich, a university professor, the woman who cleaned his office, whom he treated as an inferior being, had an academic past in Germany, the very country of the man he was desperately trying to deceive. The irony was so crushing it almost made him laugh in despair. Eleanor continued, her voice now with a slight tremor of restrained emotion as she shared a fragment of her journey. "I came back to the States to care for my parents, who were ill. And after they passed away, I needed a new start. I tried to re-enter the workforce, but no one would hire me because of my age. The doors closed." The simplicity of her explanation, the absence of self-pity, made her story even more powerful. Herr Schmidt listened intently, his face now expressing deep empathy. He then smiled, a broad, genuine smile, and turned to Michael, who looked as if he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The investor's tone changed, the admiration giving way to a cutting coldness. "Mr. Bishop," he said, now in perfect, icy English, "I don't do business with fools. And I certainly don't do business with arrogant men who humiliate the talent right under their noses." Each word was a blow, dismantling the facade of power and competence Michael had tried to build. "The deal is off." The final sentence was delivered with a finality that left no room for appeal. The gavel had fallen. Bishop Metals was doomed. Michael felt the air leave his lungs, panic seizing his mind. But the final blow was yet to come. Herr Schmidt extended his hand to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'm offering you the position of head of compliance for my new subsidiary in the United States. The salary will be triple what this man makes." He paused, glancing at the defeated CEO. "And your first task will be to oversee the bankruptcy audit of this company." Herr Schmidt's offer hung in the air, more impactful than any contract clause. For Michael, it was the final nail in the coffin of his dignity. Triple his salary to the cleaning woman. The humiliation was so profound it turned into a dull, impotent rage. He, the multi-millionaire, the titan of industry, was being discarded and replaced in his own boardroom by a woman he considered less than nothing. His mind, normally agile at calculating profits and losses, was now paralyzed. He saw his empire crumble, not because of a market crisis or a bold move by a competitor, but because of his own blind arrogance. His assets, his stock portfolio, his art collection, everything that defined his status, suddenly seemed fragile, transient. The bankruptcy audit supervised by her would be the final act of his downfall. A cold, meticulous analysis of all his mistakes, conducted by the woman he had scorned. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but no sound came out. What argument did he have? His attempt at fraud had been irrefutably exposed. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt a vertigo that wasn't from panic, but from sheer disbelief. Head of compliance, a leadership position of responsibility in a new and promising subsidiary. It was more than she had dared to dream of in recent years, an echo of a life she thought she had lost forever. Memories of Munich flooded back, the packed lecture halls, the respect of her students, the heated debates over international legislation. She had traded all of that to care for her parents, a decision she never regretted, but one whose cost was the erasure of her professional identity. The grief and financial hardship that followed had led her to accept the only job she could find, one that didn't require a resume, only a willingness to be invisible. Now, in the blink of an eye, the universe seemed to be offering her a second chance, an opportunity to reclaim the woman she had once been. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. Dignity her anchor in the storm of emotions. She looked at Herr Schmidt's outstretched hand. It was a strong, calloused hand, the hand of a man who had built his own fortune, not just inherited it. There was honesty in that gesture, a genuine invitation to a future she could barely imagine. Then her gaze shifted to Michael. She saw the broken man, the mask of power shattered, revealing the insecurity beneath. For a moment, she felt a pang of pity. He was a prisoner of his own wealth, so focused on accumulating assets that he had lost the ability to see human value. But the pity was quickly replaced by a sense of poetic justice. She hadn't sought revenge, but life, in its ironic twist, was serving it to her on a silver platter. She took a deep breath, the air in the room now seeming lighter, more breathable. She took a step forward, her shadow casting across the polished table where the fate of so many deals had been sealed. She shook Herr Schmidt's hand, the contact firm and decisive. "I accept, Herr Schmidt," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, first in German, then repeating it in English so everyone in the room would understand. It would be an honor. The handshake sealed the deal. The two translators, still in shock, began to hastily gather their papers. Eager to leave the charge room, Michael remained motionless, a statue of defeat. Herr Schmidt, with a final look of disdain at the fallen CEO, gestured for Eleanor to accompany him. "Let's go, Mom. We have much to discuss. The future awaits." As they walked toward the door, Eleanor paused for a moment and looked back at the room that had been the scene of her humiliation and, now, her redemption. She saw the untouched coffee in the porcelain cups, a silent reminder of the role she had played just minutes before. She was no longer invisible. The cleaning woman had left the room. The director was on her way to her first meeting. But as she crossed the threshold, a sudden doubt assailed her. Would she be able to take on such a huge challenge after so much time away? Wouldn't this corporate world, with its traps and power games, swallow her whole? The doubt was a cold shadow in the light of her newfound hope. The boardroom door clicked shut behind them, sealing off Michael Bishop's world and his imminent ruin. The 30th floor hallway, once a mere passageway for Eleanor, now felt like the threshold of a new reality. The grey carpet seemed softer under her worn shoes, and the artificial light from the ceiling brighter. Herr Schmidt walked beside her, not with the haste of a busy executive, but with a deliberate pace, giving her space to absorb the magnitude of the change. He led her to a more private seating area, with leather armchairs and a panoramic view of Manhattan. The city, which had so often seemed oppressive and indifferent to Eleanor, now stretched at her feet like a map of possibilities. "Please, have a seat, Eleanor," Schmidt said, the formality in his tone now mixed with genuine warmth. The transition from being she to being called by her name, from being invisible to being the center of attention, was dizzying. She sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands clasped in her lap, a habit from years of subservience that was hard to break. "I imagine this is all a shock," he began, sitting across from her. "But I want you to know that my offer was not an impulse. I recognize talent when I see it. In my business, I've learned that a company's greatest asset is not on its balance sheets or in its stock, but in its people. And today, Mr. Bishop proved to me that he understands nothing about the true value of human capital." His words were a balm to the wounds Eleanor had carried for so long. The validation, coming from a man of his caliber, was more valuable than any salary. Yet, the shadow of doubt that had assailed her at the door persisted. "Herr Schmidt," she began, her voice a little shaky, "I am immensely grateful for your confidence, but it's been a long time. The corporate world has changed. The technology, the laws, I'm not sure I still have the necessary qualifications." She hated the hesitation in her own voice, the insecurity that years of invisibility had etched into her soul. Schmidt smiled, a patient smile. "Eleanor, fundamental legal knowledge doesn't change. Ethics don't change. Intelligence and the capacity for critical analysis, which you demonstrated so brilliantly, don't get rusty. The rest, the technology, the new regulations that can be learned. We will provide the best training, give you all the support you need. What cannot be taught is character, integrity, and that, my lady, you have in spades." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "I don't need someone who just knows how to operate a piece of software. I need someone with a critical eye, someone who reads between the lines of a contract, who identifies a risk where others see only profit. I need someone who had the courage to correct an arrogant billionaire risking her job, to defend the truth. That is the person I want as my head of compliance." The conviction in his voice was contagious, and Eleanor felt a small flame of self-confidence begin to reignite within her. He continued, outlining his vision for the new American subsidiary. He spoke of investments in sustainable technology, of creating an ethical and transparent work environment, of the importance of building a solid foundation in the country. The passion with which he spoke of his business was evident, contrasting sharply with the desperate greed she had witnessed in Michael. "Your first task, the audit of Bishop Metals, will be a challenge," Schmidt admitted. "You will face resistance. Michael will not surrender his empire without a fight, even if it's a losing one. He will try to hide documents, manipulate numbers. We will need your expertise to navigate that minefield." The mention of Michael brought back the reality of the situation. She would have to return to that company, not as a cleaner, but as the authority who would unravel its secrets. She would have to face the same managers and directors who had ignored her for years. The idea was at once daunting and strangely empowering. It was a chance to close a circle, to prove not just to them, but to herself, that her value had never been in the uniform she wore. In the back of her mind, however, a nagging question began to form. What exactly had led her to speak up? Was it just a sense of justice? Or was there something more? A connection to Michael Bishop's past that even she didn't fully understand? In the days that followed, Eleanor's life transformed into a whirlwind. Herr Schmidt, true to his word, moved with impressive efficiency. He put her up in a luxury hotel, provided a generous advance so she could buy new clothes and a laptop, and scheduled a series of meetings with his company's legal team in Germany via video conference. For Eleanor, each day was a mix of euphoria and dread. The impeccably tailored business suit she bought felt like a costume. The hotel room with its city view, a borrowed set. She spent hours studying, diving into new compliance laws, devouring articles on the metals market, and trying to familiarize herself with the management software that would be her new tools. It was like waking from a long slumber, The muscles of her intellect, atrophied from years of disuse, now ached with the effort of stretching again. At times, imposter syndrome would attack with force, whispering in her ear that she was a fraud, a cleaning lady playing executive. But then she would remember Michael's sneer, the humiliation she felt, and her determination would return, stronger than before. The turning point, the moment that solidified her new identity, came a week later. Herr Schmidt summoned her to a meeting at the temporary office his company had leased, a modern, minimalist space in another Madison Avenue skyscraper. As she entered the glass-walled room, she saw they were not alone. Sitting in one of the chairs, his shoulders slumped and his face pale, was Michael Bishop. Beside him, an expensive-looking lawyer with a sour expression. The confrontation was inevitable, but Eleanor hadn't expected it so soon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the empty chair beside Herr Schmidt, who greeted her with an encouraging nod. "Mr. Bishop," Schmidt said in a formal tone, "I'd like to introduce Ms. Eleanor Schultz, our head of compliance for U.S. operations. She will be leading the audit process at your company, beginning tomorrow." The name Schultz hung in the air for a moment before it hit Michael. His eyes widened, what little color was left in his face draining away completely. He looked from Eleanor to his lawyer, then back to Eleanor, confusion and shock morphing into a dawning horror. "Schultz," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Are you related to Arthur Schultz?" Eleanor felt a chill. Arthur Schultz was her father, a brilliant engineer who, 30 years earlier, had been the minority partner to Michael's father in the founding of Bishop Metals, a man who dedicated his life and his savings to the company, only to be betrayed and forced out with a paltry sum after a cruel legal maneuver orchestrated by the elder Bishop. Her father never recovered from the blow. He lost not just his investment, but his passion, his trust in people. The struggle to survive, the debts, the sadness that settled over their family, it all came rushing back to Eleanor like a tidal wave. "He was my father," she replied, her voice low, but freighted with a weight that filled the room. "A man who believed a man's word and honor were worth more than any contract. A man your father, and later you, destroyed." The puzzle snapped into place for everyone. Eleanor's intervention at the meeting had not been a random act of justice. It was fate, the echo of an old betrayal coming back to haunt the air. Michael, who had always seen the history of Bishop Metals as a tale of his family's genius and success, was now confronted with the dark chapter that had always been omitted. The cleaning woman he had humiliated was not a stranger. She was the daughter of the man whose ruin had been the first stone in the foundation of his vast fortune. The impending audit would not just be a technical bankruptcy procedure, it would be a personal reckoning, an excavation of decades of secrets and injustice. Herr Schmidt looked from one to the other, realizing the story here ran much deeper than he had imagined. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Eleanor was no longer just a competent employee, she was the embodiment of a justice long delayed, but which, finally, seemed to have arrived. The echo of Eleanor's words, "He was my father," redefined the atmosphere of the glass-walled room, transforming a business meeting into a tribunal of memories. Michael Bishop felt the air thin in his lungs, the revelation hitting him with the force of a physical collision. Arthur Schultz. The name was a dusty relic from his childhood, a story his father would tell with a triumphant grin, the fable of how he, with his superior cunning, had outmaneuvered a dreamy, impractical partner, consolidating total control of the company that would become the bedrock of their immense fortune. In his father's narrative, Arthur was a footnote, an obstacle removed so that true business genius could flourish. Now, the daughter of that obstacle sat before him, not as a footnote, but as the author of his legacy's final chapter. The shame he felt was overwhelming, eclipsing even the fear of bankruptcy. He hadn't just humiliated a cleaning woman, he had spat on the grave of the man whose initial seed capital had made it all possible. Eleanor, for her part, felt an icy calm settle in her heart. To say those words aloud, to connect her present to her painful past, was like fitting the last piece of a puzzle that had haunted her entire life. A clear image flooded her mind, a flashback so vivid it almost transported her from the room. She was 17. Finding her father in the small workshop he'd set up in their garage, the smell of oil and cold metal in the air. Arthur Schultz wasn't working. He was just standing there, staring at an unfinished blueprint on the workbench. But his eyes were empty, lost. He had lost his spark, the infectious energy he always had when talking about his inventions. The legal battle with the elder bishop had hollowed him out, leaving behind a broken man. Disillusioned by the cruelty of the business world, "They took everything, Lena," he had whispered that day, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Not just the money, not just my patents, they took my soul." That memory, the raw pain of it, solidified Eleanor's resolve. This was no longer about a job, this was about her father's soul. Michael's lawyer, a man trained to turn crises into opportunities, was the first to break the heavy silence. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his silk tie, and addressed Herr Schmidt with an unctuous voice. "Herr Schmidt, with all due respect, this personal revelation completely changes the landscape. Ms. Schultz has a clear and profound conflict of interest. It is impossible for her to conduct an impartial audit. We must insist that she be removed from this process to ensure the fairness and legality of any assessment of Bishop Metal's assets and liabilities." It was a predictable but dangerous move. If Schmidt wavered, Eleanor's authority would be undermined before she even began. Herr Schmidt, however, remained impassive. He listened to the lawyer with calculated patience, and when he finished, an almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "On the contrary," the German replied, his tone as sharp as ice, "what you call a conflict of interest, I call unparalleled insight and motivation to find the truth. Ms. Schultz's integrity has already been amply demonstrated. Her personal connection to this company's history is not a liability. It is our greatest asset in this investigation. She knows the foundations of this business better than anyone." He turned to Eleanor, and the look they shared was one of total, unshakable trust. "The audit not only proceeds, it will now be conducted with redoubled rigor. Ms. Schultz has my full autonomy." The final defeat on Michael's face was pathetic. He and his lawyer left the room without another word, leaving a trail of failure behind them. Alone with Herr Schmidt, Eleanor felt the need to thank him, but he simply placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do what needs to be done," he said. That night, in her hotel room, Eleanor received the first digital files from Bishop Metals. They were cash flow spreadsheets, annual reports, balance sheets. Her eyes, trained by years of study and now sharpened by a personal purpose, scanned the rows and columns. Hours passed. Then she stopped. Her heart leaped. On a balance sheet from 30 years ago, just months after her father's forced exit, was a discreet, almost hidden line item. A transfer of a substantial sum in US dollars to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, registered as strategic consulting. The amount was almost exactly what her father should have received for his shares. It was the first thread, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that made her skin crawl, that when she pulled it, the entire tapestry of the Bishop fortune would begin to unravel. The early morning hours found Eleanor's eyes fixed on the laptop screen, its bluish glow illuminating her focused face. The hotel room, with its impersonal luxury, had faded away. Her world had shrunk to that single line on an old balance sheet, the transfer to the Cayman Islands holding company. It was more than an accounting anomaly. It was the materialization of an injustice that had poisoned her family for decades. Every number on that spreadsheet seemed to scream her father's untold story. She felt the adrenaline of discovery, a clarity of purpose that rejuvenated her. For the first time in many years, she was not the lonely widow, the mother who had struggled to raise her daughter, or the invisible cleaner. She was Eleanor Schultz, daughter of Arthur Schultz, and she was about to rewrite the history of Bishop Metals. Without hesitation, she drafted an email to Herr Schmidt, attaching the spreadsheet with the highlighted line and a brief analysis of her suspicions. The reply came in less than 10 minutes, despite the time difference. "Excellent work, Eleanor. This is exactly the kind of insight I was looking for. A team of my trusted forensic auditors will arrive in New York in 48 hours to support you. They will report to you. Proceed." While Eleanor felt the weight of Schmidt's support strengthening her resolve, Michael Bishop was drowning in the oppressive silence of his Park Avenue penthouse. He stood in his private study, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where he used to make billion-dollar decisions with the confidence of an emperor. Now, the room felt like a tomb. On his desk, scattered in disarray, were old photographs, him and his father on a yacht, his father receiving an award. In all of them, the elder bishop wore the same wide, predatory grin, the smile of a man who always got what he wanted. But for the first time, Michael saw something else in those photos, the shadow of Arthur Schultz. He remembered fragments of conversations, veiled references to an advantageous deal that had secured total control of the company. He had always accepted his inheritance story as gospel, proof of his superior business lineage. Now, the very framework of his identity was crumbling. His fortune, his net worth, every stock he owned was stained with the ink of an old fraud. The humiliation in the boardroom had just been the beginning. The real catastrophe was the destruction of his own myth. His lawyer called, his voice tense on the other end of the line. "Michael, they've requested unrestricted access to the servers and financial archives going back 40 years. This is a witch hunt. We can't allow it." Michael's mind, previously paralyzed by shame, began to work again, driven by the instinct for survival. "Delay," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's all we can do. Create roadblocks. Tell them the old files are on a legacy system that needs a complex migration. Tell them the main servers are undergoing emergency maintenance. Buy time. Every day we gain is a day to try to find a way out, to protect our remaining assets." The conversation continued, a desperate plan to obstruct the inevitable, to hide the bones of a skeleton that was already exposed. 2 days later, Eleanor walked through the lobby of Bishop Metals. She no longer wore the grey uniform, but a navy blue business suit that gave her a quiet authority. Beside her were 2 men and a woman, the team of forensic auditors sent by Schmidt, whose faces exuded a calm competence. The employees in the lobby, who had once ignored her, now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. As she reached the door leading to the finance department, a visibly nervous IT manager blocked her path. "I'm sorry, Ms. Schultz," he said, avoiding her gaze. "You can't enter. We're having a critical issue with the servers. All access to the financial database is temporarily suspended by order of the board." Eleanor faced him, showing no surprise. The battle had begun. The IT manager's refusal, though expected, hung in the air like a physical barrier. The 3 auditors accompanying Eleanor exchanged glances, their professional faces now showing an analytical curiosity. This was the first test of her leadership, the first trench in the war Michael Bishop had silently declared. The manager, a middle-aged man whose ID badge identified him as Sergio, was sweating visibly, his discomfort etched on his face. He was clearly a pawn, carrying out orders from above, caught in the crossfire between a crumbling power and an emerging one. Eleanor, however, showed not the slightest hesitation. She looked at Sergio not with anger, but with a calmness that was infinitely more intimidating. "Mr. Sergio," she began, her voice firm and clear, "I understand you are just following orders. However, my orders come directly from what is now the primary stakeholder in this company, Any attempt to obstruct this audit will be formally documented, minute by minute, and reported to Herr Schmidt, along with the legal implications for the board for obstruction of a pre-bankruptcy due diligence process. She paused, letting the legal weight of her words sink in. We do not need access from your terminals. We need physical access to the server room now. The threat was not empty, and Sergio knew it. He was cornered. Disobeying Michael meant his job. Disobeying Eleanor could mean a lawsuit for his bosses, in which he would be the first witness to be thrown under the bus. He swallowed hard, his gaze faltering. The physical servers are locked in a secure room. The maintenance is complex, he stammered, the flimsy excuse falling apart in his mouth. It was then that Eleanor changed tactics, seeing an opening. Very well. If the digital assets are inaccessible, we will start with the physical ones. Where is the records archive? The accounting ledgers? In cash books, investment folders from before the digital era. We want everything from the company's founding. The mention of the records archive seemed to relieve Sergio. This was likely the out Michael had offered him. Bury them in a mountain of forgotten paper, a labyrinth of bureaucracy where they could get lost for weeks, buying time for the real secrets to be better hidden or destroyed. Yes, of course. The archive is in the second sub-basement, he said, almost gratefully. No one has been down there in years. Be my guest. He led them to a freight elevator and left them in a poorly lit, damp corridor. The smell of dust and old paper was overwhelming. The archive door was a large sheet of metal, unlocked. Pushing it open, they were met with a daunting sight. Floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with identical cardboard boxes, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It was a cemetery of transactions, a tomb for decades of business. For a moment, discouragement threatened to set in, but then Eleanor remembered her father. He was not a man of Bitcoin or volatile investment funds. He was an old-school engineer, a man of paper, of fountain pens, of meticulously kept ledgers. He trusted what he could touch. My father always said, she murmured to herself, that a company's history isn't in the glossy profit and loss reports for shareholders, but in the treasurer's little notebooks. With renewed purpose, she began directing the team. Let's split up. Look for the period from the founding up to 5 years after. Look for anything that seems out of the ordinary. Cash books, board meeting minutes, capital transfer records. For hours they worked under the dim fluorescent lights, the only sound the scraping of boxes and the rustle of old papers. It was the youngest auditor, a woman named Isabel, who found it. Miss Schultz, she called out, her voice muffled by the dust. Most of the boxes from this period are here, but there's a gap. And I found this. It had fallen behind a shelf. In her gloved hand, she held not a box, but a single, black leather-bound ledger, unlike any of the others. It had no label, no date. As Eleanor opened it, she felt her heart stop. The pages did not contain ordinary accounting numbers, but a series of coded entries, names of Swiss banks, and what appeared to be a parallel record of every transaction Bishop Metals made in its first years. It was a second set of books, the definitive proof of the original fraud. The black leather cover of the ledger felt cold and heavy in Eleanor's hands, like an artifact unearthed from a forgotten tomb. The dust that flaked off it was the dust of 30 years of secrets. As she turned the yellowed pages, she recognized the handwriting. It was the slanted, elegant script of Michael's father, the elder bishop, a script she had seen once on a birthday card sent to her father back when they were still partners and friends. The sight of that writing, now chronicling the methodical dissolution of her father's capital, the deliberate betrayal, was a gut punch. It was all there, in a coded language that would mean nothing to a layman, but to her, who grew up hearing her father's technical terms, it was horrifyingly clear. Notes about the artificial devaluation of certain assets, fund transfers to numbered accounts, and the final line which made her blood run cold. ATAS, asset liquidation complete, main treasury consolidated. The Bishop family's treasury, the foundation of their multi-billion-dollar fortune, was born directly from the annihilation of Arthur Schultz's net worth. Isabel and the other auditors gathered around, watching silently as Eleanor translated the entries. The admiration on their faces was plain. They didn't just see a boss, they saw a woman on a mission for historical justice. "This," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion but firm with conviction, "is the birth certificate and the death certificate, the birth of their fortune and the death of my father's dream." She closed the book with a dull thud that echoed in the archive's silence. "Scan every page. High resolution. Make 3 backups on different servers, outside the US. This book does not leave my side." The team nodded, the gravity of the moment uniting them in a common purpose. They were no longer just auditing a company on the brink of bankruptcy. They were unearthing the roots of a dynasty, exposing the fraud that had allowed for the accumulation of so much power and money. Meanwhile, in his mahogany fortress, Michael Bishop received the call he had been dreading. It was Sergio, the IT manager, his voice trembling and apologetic. "Sir, they didn't push for the server. They went to the records archive, and they found something, an old book." Mrs. Schultz seemed shaken. She took it with her. Michael felt the phone slip from his sweaty hand. The records archive, the paper cemetery he had thought was safe. His father, in all his arrogance, had never bothered to destroy the evidence, perhaps believing no one would ever dare to look for it. That book, he remembered his father referring to it once, years ago, as his business diary, the proof of his genius, but it was the proof of his crime. Panic gave way to an icy rage. Eleanor wasn't just after the company's money. She was after his inheritance, his family name, his very identity. Legal tactics, bureaucratic roadblocks. None of that would work now. She had the weapon. He needed something to stop her, something that would hit her where no contract clause could reach. He stood and walked to the large window of his study, looking out at the city he had always considered his domain. He thought of Eleanor, her calm, her dignity. Where was her weakness? No one is untouchable. Everyone has a pressure point. Family. It's always family. He picked up the phone again, his hand steady now, his knuckles white. He dialed the number for his head of security, a man who solved problems that money couldn't solve publicly. "Ricardo," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous, devoid of any panic. "I need everything you can find on Eleanor Schultz. Family, friends, anything. Specifically, I want to know about her children, if she has any, where they live, what they do." There was a pause. "She has a daughter. A single daughter. I want the name, the address, the phone number. Find her daughter. Now." The black-bound book lay on the table in Eleanor's hotel room like a ticking time bomb. Each entry, each coded number, was a piece of ammunition she was methodically organizing. For the past 2 days, she and the audit team had worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the information from the secret ledger with the few digital records they could access and the paper files from the archive. The result was a devastating dossier, a detailed map not only of the original fraud against her father, but of a pattern of tax evasion, balance sheet manipulation, and embezzlement that spanned 3 decades. The Bishop fortune was not just tainted at its source, it was maintained by a web of illegalities. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility, but also a strange lightness. Justice, for so long an abstract and distant entity, was now something tangible, something she was building with her own hands. The next morning, she would present the preliminary report to Herr Schmidt. It would be the end of Bishop Metals and the end of Michael's legacy. This was the moment of highest tension, the climax of her journey, the emotional resolution she sought. That evening, she decided to take a short walk to clear her head before the decisive day. The cool New York air wrapped around her as she stepped through the hotel's revolving door. She didn't go far. just to the small plaza across the street, an oasis of calm amidst the city's chaos. She sat on a bench, watching the car lights streak by like falling stars. That's when a shadow materialized beside her, making her jump. It was Michael, but not the arrogant CEO from the boardroom. This was a different man. His expensive suit was wrinkled, he was unshaven, and his bloodshot eyes burned with the fire of desperation. He smelled of whiskey and fear. "Ah, you must be feeling very satisfied," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "The cleaning lady who became a queen, the avenger for the poor and oppressed, destroying a man's life over a 30-year-old story." Eleanor stood up, her heart pounding, but her face remained calm. "This isn't about the past, Michael. It's about the truth of the present. The fraud never stopped." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Truth? Don't talk to me about truth." He took a step forward, invading her personal space. "Let's talk about what's real, what really matters." He pulled a phone from his pocket and turned the screen toward her. It was a photo, a picture of a smiling young woman with curly hair in front of a computer screen with graphic designs. Eleanor felt the air get knocked out of her lungs. It was Anna, her daughter. "Anna, isn't it?" Michael continued, savoring every word. "It lives in Williamsburg, a talented graphic designer, loves to jog in Central Park on Sunday mornings." He put the phone away, his eyes locked on hers. "I've lost my company. My fortune is about to turn to dust, but I still have resources. I still have influence, and I have nothing left to lose." The implied threat was more terrifying than any physical violence. "What are you trying to say?" Eleanor whispered, her voice failing for the first time. Michael smiled, a smile devoid of any joy. "I can make her life a living hell. Lawsuits, investigations into her clients, slander online, anonymous tips to her profession's ethics board. I will bury her in so much trouble she'll never know where it came from. The career she's worked so hard to build will disappear." The ultimatum was clear. Her daughter's life for her father's soul. The future versus the past. For a moment, Eleanor faltered, the image of Anna's smile nearly breaking her. Then she looked at the man before her, at his pathetic display of power, and a cutting clarity washed over her. "You really haven't understood anything, have you, Michael?" she said, her voice regaining its strength. "You think you're threatening me with the one thing I love, but you're just proving that love is the one thing you've never had." Michael stepped back, his silhouette dissolving into the plaza's darkness, leaving behind a silence charged not with fear, but with absolute clarity. Eleanor remained motionless for a long moment, her heart, which had been racing, now settling into a calm, powerful rhythm. The threat against Anna, Michael's lowest and cruelest card, had not broken her. On the contrary, it had incinerated the last particle of doubt left in her soul. He had tried to use her love as a weapon, but had only revealed his own inability to comprehend such a feeling. Eleanor's love for her daughter was not a weakness to be exploited. It was the source of her strength, the rock upon which she had rebuilt herself. Michael's act of desperation was not a show of power, but the last gasp of a man who had already lost everything that mattered: his honor, his dignity, and himself. He was no longer an adversary to be feared, merely a ghost haunted by his own ruin. She didn't need to worry about Anna, because a man with no moral capital, and soon no financial capital, had no power at all. His fortune was a sandcastle, and the tide of truth was coming in. The next morning, the boardroom at Herr Schmidt's new subsidiary was a study in contrasts. On one side of the long glass table sat Eleanor and Schmidt, calm and confidence radiating from them. On the other side, Michael and his lawyer seemed like shrunken figures, the previous night's arrogance replaced by a deathly pallor. The black-bound book sat in the center of the table, its silence more eloquent than any speech. Eleanor didn't begin with accusations. With the precision of a scholar and the authority of a director, She projected the dossier her team had assembled onto a large screen. She presented the parallel cash flow, the transfers to tax havens, the entries from the secret ledger. Each slide was a nail in the coffin of the Bishop Empire. She didn't narrate a story of revenge, but an audit of facts. She demonstrated with irrefutable proof how the original fraud against Arthur Schultz was not an isolated event, but the business model upon which the family's entire fortune and legacy had been built for 30 years. Bishop Metals, she concluded, her voice resonating with unquestionable authority, is not just insolvent. It is, and has been since its inception, fundamentally fraudulent. The silence that followed was broken by Herr Schmidt. He didn't address Eleanor, but fixed his gaze on Michael, who was staring at the table, unable to look at anyone. "Mr. Bishop," the German said, his tone cold and final, "in light of the evidence of systematic fraud and financial crime, we are no longer discussing a supervised bankruptcy. My company will be filing a criminal lawsuit against you and the board of Bishop Metals. Furthermore, an emergency petition will be filed today to freeze all of your personal assets, including overseas accounts, to ensure restitution for the creditors and victims of your practices." Every word was a hammer blow. Michael's lawyer opened his mouth but said nothing. There was no defense. Michael slowly raised his head, and for the first time, Eleanor saw in his eyes not anger or arrogance, but an absolute emptiness. The man who defined himself by his money, by his fortune, had just had that identity erased. He had nothing left. The threat against Anna was now what it had always been, the empty bluff of a man who was bankrupt in every sense of the word. Justice for her father was done. The conflicts had been resolved. And there, sitting at the head of the table, Eleanor Schultz felt the weight of 30 years finally lift from her shoulders. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Eleanor's new office. On the same 30th floor that had once been the epicenter of her humiliation, the logo on the glass wall no longer read Bishop Metals, but Schmidt Precision Technologies, USA. The air was no longer heavy with the tension of desperation, but vibrated with the energy of a new beginning. Eleanor, now president of US operations, looked out at the New York City skyline, not as a chessboard of lost opportunities, but as a garden she was helping to cultivate. The transition hadn't been easy, but with each passing day, she felt more at home in her own skin, the executive identity fitting as comfortably as her old work shoes. The bankruptcy proceedings for Bishop Metals had been long and complex, but under her supervision, justice prevailed. Michael's assets were liquidated, and a significant portion of the capital was used to compensate laid-off employees and defrauded creditors. A portion, designated by the court as historical restitution, was used to create a scholarship fund for low-income engineering students in the name of Arthur Schultz. Her father's soul, which he had felt was stolen, was now being honored, transforming the pain of the past into hope for the future. That day, Eleanor had a special meeting. She walked across her office, past a photo on her desk. She and Anna, smiling, arm in arm, during a recent trip they took to Munich. A trip to close the circle, to revisit the places where Eleanor had been happy as a professor, and to show her daughter the strength of her own roots. The door opened, and her assistant announced her visitor. Herr Schmidt walked in, not as a distant boss, but as a friend and mentor. "Eleanor," he said with a warm smile, "the place looks magnificent. You've done a remarkable job." They talked about the business, about the growing profitability of the new operation, about the investments in clean technology they were making. They discussed the first semester's dividends, which had surpassed all expectations. The conversation flowed easily, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. There were no power games, only the satisfaction of building something solid and ethical. At the end of their conversation, Herr Schmidt handed her an envelope. This is for you, a bonus for your exceptional performance. But I suggest you don't invest it in stocks or the market. Eleanor opened it and saw a check for a substantial amount far beyond any money she had ever imagined possessing. Tucked inside with the check was a note. The greatest asset is human capital, and sometimes the best investment we can make is in ourselves. Go take a vacation. You've earned it. Tears of gratitude welled in Eleanor's eyes. They were tears that washed away the last scars of invisibility. She was no longer defined by her losses, but by her resilience. She had turned humiliation into triumph, injustice into justice, and suffering into wisdom. Looking out at the city again, she thought of Michael Bishop, who was serving time for his financial crimes. She felt no hatred, not even pity. She only felt the confirmation of a universal truth. A fortune built on arrogance is merely a sandcastle, but a life built on dignity is a fortress that no storm can tear down. She picked up the phone and called her daughter. "Anna, honey, how about a trip? There's a whole world I want to show you." Her journey of suffering had come to an end, but her new journey of living fully was just beginning.